Chapter 14. After Scarlett left Rhett's hotel room, she walked slowly along the street, thinking, how was she going to get the money to buy that factory now? Rhett had ruined all her plans. How she hated him! I should have known he'd never understand, Scarlett thought. Her angry thoughts were interrupted by a man calling her name.
Miss Scarlett, hello.
Why, it's Frank Kennedy. How are you? Said Scarlett. Frank Kennedy was an older man in his late 40s, whom Scarlett had known for a few years now. He had visited Tara many times to see Sue Ellen, Scarlett's younger sister. Scarlett did not like her sister very much, and couldn't understand why Frank was interested in her. Not that Frank was very handsome, rich, or intelligent himself. Frank had thin, red hair and a silly expression on his face all the time. But now, after her meeting with Rhett, it was nice to talk to a man who knew how to treat a lady. Frank offered Scarlett a ride back to Aunt Pittypat's home in his carriage. He was very anxious to know how Sue Ellen was doing.
Miss Scarlett, I'm going to ask her to marry me very soon now. You see, I've been able to save some money. I have a store here, and I've been able to make about $1,000 already.
$1,000. To Scarlett, this was like all the money in the world. She looked at Frank with new interest in her eyes. Why, Frank, that's amazing. Tell me, how did you do it? Everyone is so poor these days after the war. Frank turned red. He was very shy around women, and so he was very excited to have pretty Scarlett O'Hara, Sue Ellen's sister, talking to him. He had always preferred Sue Ellen to Scarlett because Sue Ellen was sweet and ladylike. But Scarlett was very charming, and she looked so nice in her green dress with her red lips smiling and her large green eyes shining like jewels.
Well, Miss Scarlett, after the war was over, I came immediately back to Atlanta. I had a little money, and I bought a little building and made it into a store. For the first few months, I had almost no business, but now there are many Northerners living in Atlanta, you know. They're rebuilding the South, and they just control everything now. I don't like it at all, but they do buy my products. So I've been able to save lots of money.
Scarlett was thinking quickly. She had another idea on how to get the money for that factory. If Frank was becoming rich, then she, not Sue Ellen, should be the one to marry Frank. Frank could give her any money she needed to help Tara. She would still buy a factory and run it herself, but she would wait a little while, until she had been married to Frank for a few months. Scarlett knew she could control Frank because he was so silly, like an old woman more than a man. Of course, Sue Ellen would hate her for stealing her man, but, well, Sue Ellen would just have to understand. I'll be doing her a favor, thought Scarlett. Frank's so old and silly that I don't know why Sue Ellen wants to marry him anyway. She can find a younger man for a husband any time. Scarlett turned to Frank with her sweetest smile. Oh, Frank, it is so good to see you. I've missed seeing you at Tara.
Oh, Miss Scarlett, how is Sue Ellen? Does she ask about me?
Scarlett's face grew very sad. Oh, dear, I think I'm going to cry. What an awful, terrible, mean sister I have.
What is it, Miss Scarlett?
Cried Frank. He turned pale. Well, it's just that Sue Ellen got tired of waiting for you, and she was afraid she'd never get married, and... Well, Frank, she's going to marry one of the country boys next month. Oh, dear, I could just cry. Frank looked miserable and said nothing. But, Frank, don't worry about her. Sue Ellen's just selfish and terrible, I think. If I was going to marry you, I'd never want anyone else. Now, here we are at my Aunt Pitty-Pat's house. Please come in and stay for supper. I would so love to talk to you, Scarlett said sweetly. She put her hand on his arm. Frank was terribly unhappy about Sue Ellen's marriage. Of course, he did not know that Scarlett was lying. He was excited by Scarlett's sweet words and the way she looked at him, as if he were a big, strong man who could protect her. That night, Frank went to supper at Aunt Pitty-Pat's house. 3 days later, Scarlett returned to Tara as Mrs. Kennedy. In 3 days' time, she had married Frank. She had told him, with many tears and sighs, that she needed money to feed her family and buy cotton seeds to plant at Tara. Frank had given Scarlett $300. Sue Ellen was furious when she found out what Scarlett had done, of course. She cried and screamed and slammed all the doors in the house. I hate her! I hate her! Oh, she took my Mr. Kennedy! I was going to marry him, and she went and stole him. Sue Ellen, try to understand. Scarlett did it to help Tara, said Melanie, trying to comfort Sue Ellen. Ashley had said nothing, only stared at Scarlett with a look of shock, and then left the room. Scarlett wondered what he thought of her marriage. No, she didn't! She did it because she's mean and hateful, cried Sue Ellen. After that, Sue Ellen wouldn't speak to Scarlett any more, but Scarlett didn't care. All she cared about was that she had the money for Tara that it needed. Scarlett planned to return to Atlanta in a few days, but first she wanted to speak to Ashley. She wanted him and Melanie to move to Atlanta, not only because Scarlett wanted him to be near her, but because she wanted to help Ashley find something to do with his life. That afternoon, she found him sitting in the living room, staring out the window. Ashley, I wanted to talk to you about something before I go back to Atlanta, Scarlett said cheerfully. Ashley turned to look at her.
Scarlett, I can't forgive myself for allowing you to go off to Atlanta and marry Mr. Kennedy. I should have known what you were planning to do and tried to stop you. I should be breaking my back in the fields of Tara helping you to raise money. After everything you've done for Melanie and the baby, I should have helped you more. I know you don't love Frank. You only married him to help us at Tara. You're so unselfish, Scarlett, but it's as if you've sold yourself in marriage.
Oh, Ashley, said Scarlett. They stared at one another. Neither one could really say what they were thinking. Ashley, there was something I wanted to talk to you about. I wanted you and Melanie to move to Atlanta. I can help you find a job, and you and Melanie can live with Frank and me at Aunt Pitty-Pat's house until you have enough money to buy your own place. Wouldn't it be nice? Ashley shook his head sadly.
Scarlett, I've made a decision. I meant to tell you before. I'm taking Melanie and the baby and moving to New York City. I can find a job working in a bank there. I must leave the South, Scarlett. There is nothing here for me anymore. I cannot live off your charity anymore. I feel terrible.
Scarlett was shocked and afraid. Ashley couldn't leave the South. She would never see him again. Oh, but Ashley, you don't need to move to New York. I can give you a wonderful job in Atlanta. I'm going to buy a lumber factory and run it myself. You know how good with numbers I am. I'm sure that I can do it. I'll let you have a lot of responsibility.
No, Scarlett,
Ashley said quietly.
I'm sure that you'll be a great success. You're strong and brave, and I'm not. But it would feel like charity to me. I'm grateful to you for everything you've done for me and my family. But it's time for me to leave. For the first time in my life, I want to be independent, you see.
And he turned to leave the room. Scarlett didn't know what to say. She did not really understand Ashley's feelings. Why did he need to be independent? All he needed to be happy was money, a nice house, and a job. Oh, yes, and those books and poetry. Couldn't he have all those things in Atlanta? Why did he want to leave her? "Oh, Ashley!" cried Scarlett and burst into tears. When Ashley heard her crying, he turned around and went to comfort her. But she turned away from him and threw herself onto the couch. Melanie heard the sound of crying and came into the room. "Darling, what's the matter?" she said gently, running to the couch and taking Scarlett in her arms. "It's Ashley! Oh, he's so mean and hateful!" cried Scarlett, tears running down her face. "What have you done?" Melanie asked her husband anxiously. "I asked him to come to Atlanta and work for me, and he won't. He says you all are moving to New York. How could he do this when I need him in Atlanta?" cried Scarlett. She was too upset to think calmly. Melanie stood up and looked at Ashley. Her normally gentle face looked almost angry. "Ashley, think," she said. "Just think what Scarlett's done for us. For me. How can you refuse to help her when she needs you? I would have died the night Atlanta was attacked if Scarlett hadn't saved me and the baby. And when I think of how hard she's worked since the end of the war, picking cotton and working outside just so that we could have food to eat, oh, my darling." And Melanie put her arms around Scarlett. Ashley's face was white. He looked like a man who has lost a great battle.
"Scarlett, do you really want me to come to Atlanta?"
he said slowly. "Yes, Ashley, I really do," cried Scarlett.
"And Melanie, do you really think we should move there?"
he asked his wife. "Oh, darling, just think how wonderful it would be to be with our family. New York is so terribly far away," said Melanie.
"Then I will come to Atlanta. I cannot fight you both,"
said Ashley. In his mind, Ashley felt as if his one chance for independence and happiness had been destroyed. As he turned to leave the room, Scarlett saw the look on his face. He was a man in terrible pain. Suddenly, she didn't feel so happy about her victory. "Oh, Ashley, I can't bear for you to be unhappy," she wanted to cry out. But he was already gone. Chapter 15. A few days later, Scarlett took Mammy and Wade and returned to Atlanta to be with Frank. He, Scarlett, Mammy, and Wade moved into Aunt Pitty-Pat's house, since she had a lot of room. A month later, Melanie and Ashley moved into a small house in Atlanta. They had almost no money, but they were able to buy a small and rather ugly house. In a month's time, Scarlett had convinced Frank to give her the rest of the money she needed to buy the little lumber factory. When she came back to Atlanta, she had been worried that it would be sold, but it was still there. Of course, Frank was shocked and upset that his wife wanted to do something like buy a factory. Frank was very traditional, and in those days women did not do such things. It was not at all ladylike. But Scarlett cried and pleaded, and was so sweet and charming to him that he finally said,
"Well, honey, if you want to try your little idea, I suppose it won't hurt anything. But don't worry your pretty head over the factory too much. Let Ashley do that."
Frank did not really know his wife. He did not know that Scarlett was extremely good at mathematics and was very stubborn and determined. These qualities meant that she would be good at business. He also did not know about her temper. Scarlett bought the factory and immediately began to find men to work in it. The men she found were criminals who were released from prison on the condition that they work somewhere. They were terribly poor, angry young men who were often very dangerous. Scarlett hired a man named Archie to watch the men and make sure they did their work. Archie was a man from the mountains of the southern state of North Carolina. He had once been a criminal himself and had been sent to prison for killing his wife. In the war, he had lost a leg and an eye. He was the meanest person Scarlett had ever known. She had not wanted to hire a man like this, but Archie had told her he could make the men work hard, and she wouldn't have to worry about them. The factory did very well, because there were many people in Atlanta who needed wood. Scarlett was able to send plenty of money to Will at Tara. Ashley was given a job managing the factory's office. He was not nearly as good at this kind of work as Scarlett was, but Scarlett was very forgiving of his mistakes. Soon, however, Scarlett discovered something very upsetting. She was pregnant again. Scarlett had not wanted to have any more children, as she was not close to her son, Wade Hamilton. Wade had spent most of his time with Mammy or Prissy and barely knew his mother. Frank was extremely happy at the news and hoped for a son. However, Scarlett's baby turned out to be a rather ugly little girl. They named her Ella Lorena. After Ella's birth, Scarlett told herself she was definitely not having any more children. Her waist was not quite as small and pretty as it used to be. In all this time, Rhett Butler had not been to visit Scarlett once, and she had not seen him. Rhett had returned to New Orleans for a time, but no one in Atlanta knew the reason why. When he returned to Atlanta, he shocked everyone in society by becoming friends with a woman named Belle Watling. Belle owned a house of prostitutes in Atlanta, and no one who thought of themselves as good and proper would speak to her. Every mother told her daughter to stay away from Belle. Rhett, of course, had never cared what people thought of him. People had seen him entering Belle's house. Soon the most terrible things were being said about Rhett, but as usual, he did not care. Scarlett, of course, had heard all the talk about Rhett, and she believed it. "So he really is a terrible man. Just what I thought," she said to Frank one evening. Frank agreed with her. Although Scarlett didn't really like being married, Frank was all right, and she liked him. Often they had pleasant evenings together. Frank would think to himself that Scarlett was such a sweet, pretty, charming little wife, when she had her way. Scarlett didn't like always having to be sweet, because sometimes she was tired from working with Ashley in her factory's office and would lose her temper. She didn't want to come home and have to be a good little wife to Frank. but they got along well most of the time. Time passed. A few months after Ella Lorena's birth, Scarlett noticed that Frank was staying out more often, late into the night. She knew that Frank wasn't with another woman because he was not the kind of man to do such things. Frank always told her he was working late at his store. Melanie told Scarlett that Ashley also was staying out late as well. Both women thought that their men must be drinking together after work. Melanie was very worried about Ashley. Scarlett didn't mind Frank being out because then he wouldn't bother her. Neither one of the women knew the truth. After the war was over, the South's black slaves had been given their freedom by the Northerners. Now, many of the young black men walked the streets of Atlanta, doing whatever they wanted. While most of the black people were trying to find work, feed their families, and live in the new society, some of the former slaves were drinking all day and causing much trouble for the white women. Some women had almost been seriously hurt by these men. However, the new laws made by Northerners made it illegal to punish a former slave. Frank and Ashley had become part of a secret group of Southern men called the Ku Klux Klan. If a Southern woman was hurt by a black man, the Ku Klux Klan would try to find the black man who had done it and kill him. Frank and Ashley had been going out at night and having meetings with other men who belonged to this group. Sometimes these men would go to the little towns where former slaves lived and threaten them. But when Scarlett put herself into danger, things became very bad. Scarlett had decided to drive herself around Atlanta in a carriage alone, with no man to protect her. She would go to the factory and return to Aunt Pitty Pat's home, where she and Frank lived, by herself. Frank, Melanie, Aunt Pitty Pat, and even Ashley begged her not to do this.
"Why don't you get Uncle Peter to drive you around?"
Frank asked. But Scarlett was stubborn. "Frank, I can get so much more done at the factory if I don't have Uncle Peter waiting for me. It's just easier if I drive alone." One evening, Scarlett was returning home from the factory when she was attacked by a very drunken black man. He was trying to climb into her carriage and steal her money, or worse. Luckily, another black man nearby heard her screams and was able to chase away the attacker. It was about 9 o'clock in the evening when this man returned with the frightened Scarlett, her clothes torn and dirty. Scarlett was shocked and angry to see Frank's reaction. He was very concerned about her, but he said,
"Now, honey, don't you worry your pretty little head about this. I'll take care of everything. Now, I have to work late at the store this evening. Don't wait for me. Just go to bed now."
He kissed her on the cheek and walked out the door. "Well, what is the matter with him? I thought he would be more concerned about his own wife," cried Scarlett. She did not know what Frank was really about to do. Scarlett went to sleep, but when she woke up 6 hours later, Frank was not lying in the bed next to her. Where was he? For some reason, Scarlett felt afraid. She got up and was lighting a candle when she heard a knock on the door. All the servants were sleeping, and so Scarlett was the only one who could answer it. She went downstairs quickly and looked through a window. Rhett was standing on the front porch. Why was he here at this late hour? Scarlett opened the door. "Rhett, what are you doing here? It's so late. And Frank—"
"Scarlett, that's what I'm here about. Come into the living room and sit down." Frank and Ashley went to try and find the black man who attacked you. They're members of a group called the Ku Klux Klan. Maybe you have heard of them.
Yes, Rhett, I have heard of them. But Frank wouldn't join any group like that. He told me he was working late at the store.
Well, he's been lying to you, Scarlett. No one thought you should be driving yourself around alone at night. It was certain that you would be attacked by someone, but you insisted on being independent, and Frank and Ashley felt that they had to protect your honor by killing this man. If the Northern police catch members of the Ku Klux Klan, they'll be sent to prison or maybe even killed.
Scarlett sat down. She was too shocked and afraid to say anything. Rhett, what am I going to do? Where is Frank now? Rhett took her hand.
I'm sorry, Scarlett. He's dead. He was killed in the fight.
Scarlett closed her eyes. Is Ashley all right?
Yes.
How do you know all this, Rhett? Asked Scarlett.
I heard what had happened to you, so I knew that Frank and Ashley would immediately try to find the man. I saw them leaving Ashley's house at about 10 o'clock. I had to find a horse to follow them. I was able to help Ashley defend himself. We were fighting a group of black men, very strong, but we were able to defend ourselves and escape. But it was too late for Frank. When I arrived, he was already dead. He was killed with a knife.
Scarlett cried out and fainted. Rhett caught her as she fell to the ground, carried her upstairs, and put her into bed.